My hands were trembling so badly, I could barely hold the small manila envelope in front of me. The sterile, white-walled clinic room felt unreal, like I had been transported to a place where time slowed and every sound was magnified. The nurse spoke slowly, cautiously, almost as if the words themselves were dangerous. "Mary, the DNA test confirms it. She is your biological daughter." I stared at her, my mind refusing to connect the words with reality. I had adopted her when I was 22, believing I was giving a tiny, helpless orphan a life she deserved. All these years, I had poured my heart into her, loved her, raised her as my own, but never once had I imagined that the child I had embraced as a stranger, as a gift to my compassion, had been my own. The room tilted. I felt dizzy, like the floor had dropped beneath me. Every memory of her, the first time I held her, the tiny suitcase she carried, the orphanage smell that clung to her clothes flashed in my mind, with new, terrifying clarity. That longing I'd always felt in my chest when I looked at her, that gnawing sense that she was more than just a child I had chosen to raise. It wasn't intuition. It was recognition. A truth someone had hidden from me. Someone who had decided that I should never know my own child. My throat tightened, my pulse thundered in my ears, and I could barely breathe. 36 years of my life had been built on a lie, a carefully constructed lie that had I remembered the day I first saw her. She was small, quiet, sitting alone on a wooden bench in the orphanage, clutching a tattered blanket to her chest. I had been a young woman then, full of idealism, convinced that I could make a difference. I knelt in front of her, smiling gently, trying to coax a reaction. She didn't cry. She didn't flinch. She just stared at me with those wide, cautious eyes, as though measuring my worth, testing my sincerity. And I had felt a strange, unnameable tug in my heart, as though something ancient and familiar was pulling me toward her. I had dismissed it as motherly instinct, a bond forming simply because I chose to love her. I had no idea that bond was deeper than I could ever imagine it had been, the echo of a connection that had been stolen from me long before I had even held her in my arms. Bringing her home was a blur of excitement, anxiety, and exhaustion. I can still see her tiny body in my arms as we drove through rainy streets, the first drops of water streaking across the windshield. I whispered promises to her that I didn't fully understand at the time. I would protect her. I would give her a life filled with love. I would never abandon her. She was small, fragile, yet I sensed a stubborn spirit inside her that mirrored my own. I marveled at her little fingers, her hair falling across her forehead, the subtle curl of her lips when she finally relaxed in my embrace. I thought I was rescuing her from a cruel world, but in reality, she was rescuing me too, though neither of us knew it. Years passed. She grew into a bright, defiant, and fiercely independent young woman. I remember arguing with her over homework, friendships, fashion choices, trivial things, but each fight left me both exasperated and strangely proud. Every triumph, every failure, every scraped knee I treated, every night I stayed awake worrying about her future. I did it all with unconditional love. I thought I was giving her everything. But the hollow ache I sometimes felt, the restless nights when I questioned if I was enough, were rooted in something I hadn't recognized until that moment in the clinic. That ache had been a mother's intuition, whispering the truth. She was mine. She always had been, and the world had tried to steal her from me. The day I found out was surreal. I had gone to the adoption agency for a routine follow-up, something I assumed would be mundane. I never anticipated that one simple procedure would shatter the foundation of my life. When the nurse said those words, "She is your biological daughter," my brain refused to process them at first. I laughed, a hollow, disbelieving sound, hoping it would dispel the horror of the truth. But every detail of my life came crashing down around me. The photographs, the memories, the holidays we had celebrated together, the arguments, the nights spent comforting her, all of it suddenly carried a weight I hadn't understood before. Every hug I had given her, every tear I had wiped from her face, had been instinctively, irreversibly tied to her as my own flesh and blood. I drove home in a daze, gripping the steering wheel as though it were the only thing tethering me to reality. The streets blurred beneath my eyes. The gray sky above mirrored the storm inside me. I thought of her, my daughter, my child, the girl I had raised as a stranger yet loved as my own, and I felt a mixture of grief, rage, and awe. How had this been hidden from me for so long? Who had the right to make such a decision? And yet, amid the shock, I felt a flicker of wonder, a strange exhilaration that my instincts had never been wrong. She had been mine all along. I had loved her as my own, and somehow, fate had allowed me to do it without knowing the truth. That night, I sat alone in her empty bedroom, the walls echoing with memories of laughter, tears, whispered stories, and late-night fears. I traced every moment in my mind, the nights I rocked her to sleep, the first steps she had taken in the living room, the mornings we had rushed to get her ready for school. The days after I learned the truth were a blur, a relentless storm of emotions I couldn't control. I tried to go about my life as usual, but nothing felt usual anymore. Every laugh, every argument, every simple moment with her took on a new, almost unbearable weight. I found myself staring at her across the kitchen table, watching the way she reached for her coffee, the subtle curve of her cheek, the familiar tilt of her jaw, and my chest tightened with a mixture of wonder and grief. How had I never noticed? How could the universe, or the people who had orchestrated this, let me live for decades without knowing the truth that was, somehow, so obvious all along? I thought about the moment I had first chosen her. She had been so small, fragile, wary of everyone around her. She clung to her tattered blanket like it was the only thing keeping her alive. And I had felt a pull in my chest that I couldn't explain, a sense of destiny, as if I had known her forever. At the time, I chalked it up to motherly instinct, a bond that grew naturally from love and care. But now I realized that instinct had been the echo of something much deeper. She wasn't just a child who needed me. She was the part of me that had been taken away, returned in a strange, roundabout way through a life I had spent building together with her. It was during that drive that I began piecing together the fragments of my past. I remembered the night I was told I couldn't have children. The tears, the disbelief, the heartbreak that had seemed absolute at the time, now took on a bitterly ironic edge. I had carried her in my body, in my heart, in every instinct I had ever had, and yet I had been told she was gone. And now, decades later, I was faced with the staggering truth that life had given us a second chance, wrapped in layers of secrecy and deception. The rage was there, simmering, but beneath it all was a pulse of profound gratitude that she had been in my life all along. When I returned home, I couldn't face her directly. I wandered through the house, touching the walls, remembering the nights we had curled up together on the sofa, the school projects we had completed side by side, the small rituals that had built the rhythm of our shared life. Every moment now felt magnified, charged with new significance. She had been mine from the start. Everything I had felt for her, every instinct, every pang of worry, every unreasoned joy, was validated by the truth. But how could I tell her? How could I explain that the life we had shared, seemingly ordinary, had been extraordinary in ways she could not yet understand? Over the next few weeks, I oscillated between anger and longing, between grief for the lost years and awe at the bond that had always existed. I thought about confronting the family who had hidden the truth, about demanding justice, about unearthing every document and every lie that had separated us. But then I realized something else. The truth was more than documents or apologies. The truth was in her, in the way she looked at me, in the way our hands fit perfectly together, in the laughter we shared, The world could keep its secrets. The bond between a mother and her child, even hidden for decades, cannot be erased. One night, I sat in her bedroom, alone, letting memories wash over me like a tidal wave. I thought about the first time I had held her, the first time she had called me Mom, the nights we had stayed up talking, the countless scraped knees and broken hearts I had comforted. Each moment was now layered with a depth I hadn't understood at the time. The child I had rescued, nurtured, and loved had been mine all along. And now, knowing the truth, I felt an almost dizzying mixture of sorrow and joy. Sorrow for the years we had unknowingly spent apart in heart and history. Joy that fate had finally returned what had always belonged to me. In the quiet of that night, I realized something essential. Love cannot be diminished by deception, by time, or by absence. I had loved my daughter without knowing she was mine. And that love had always been real, instinctive, irrevocable. Now, armed with the truth, I could embrace the depth of that bond fully, acknowledge the pain of lost years, and move forward with an unshakable devotion to her. The road ahead would be uncertain, full of confrontation, emotion, and reckoning, but it was a path I was ready to walk, hand in hand with the daughter I had unknowingly raised, finally aware of the profound connection that had always existed between us. I couldn't sleep that night. Every corner of the house seemed to whisper the past at me, each memory a cruel reminder of what had been hidden for decades. I kept seeing her face, my daughter's face, in flashes behind my closed eyelids. It was uncanny how familiar it felt, how instinctively I knew the shape of her smile, the cadence of her voice, the subtle quirks that made her who she was. It wasn't just motherly love I had felt all these years. It was recognition, a connection written into my very blood, ignored by those who had claimed to protect me. I tried to imagine a scenario where this wasn't true, a way to rationalize it, but I couldn't. The evidence was undeniable, and it consumed every rational thought. By morning, I had made a decision. I needed answers, and I needed them now. I couldn't continue living in this haze of uncertainty. I returned to the adoption agency, my hands tight around the envelope containing the DNA report, my chest heavy with a mix of anticipation, dread, and anger. The receptionist recognized me instantly and led me to the same office where I had first been given the news. The older woman who had spoken to me before looked up, her face masking an expression I could not read. "Mary," she said softly, almost hesitantly. "I was wondering when you would come back. I didn't have patience for pleasantries. I need to know everything," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. Every detail. Who made this decision? Why was I kept in the dark? How could someone hide my own child from me? I could see her flinch, a subtle contraction of the jaw, and I felt a small, grim satisfaction. They had built walls around me, walls of secrecy and lies, and now I was tearing them down, demanding the truth. She sighed, leaning back in her chair. "Mary, it wasn't simple. At the time, the circumstances surrounding the child's birth were complicated. Your family situation, the agency's policies, legal restrictions, it all seemed to indicate that you couldn't handle the truth. We thought we were protecting you, protecting me." The word echoed in my mind, absurd and cruel. Protecting me by keeping me away from my own daughter for decades? I felt a wave of rage that almost knocked me from my chair. "Protecting me?" I said, my voice rising. "You call this protection? You stole 36 years of my life, every birthday, every scraped knee, every triumph, every heartbreak. How could that be protection?" Her gaze softened, almost pitying, and I hated it. "We were trying to prevent a scandal, to avoid additional trauma for you and for the child. You were very young. We believed we were doing the right thing, doing the right thing." I felt the bitterness curling inside me like smoke, filling my chest. The life I had built, the home, the love, the sacrifices I had done, all of that believing I was saving a child who needed me, And in some cosmic, cruel twist, I was right. But I had been denied the knowledge that the child I had been saving all along was my own. Every moment I had shared with her, every sleepless night, every tear shed over her scraped knees, had been instinctive, irrevocable, and now charged with a truth I had been forbidden to know. When I left the agency, I didn't return home. I drove aimlessly through streets I had traveled countless times, each one suddenly alien, as if the world itself had shifted. My mind raced, replaying every memory, every moment of our life together, analyzing each interaction with the lens of the revelation. I remembered the way she had tilted her head when I scolded her for misbehaving, the familiar stubbornness that mirrored my own, the secret glances we shared when no one else was looking. All those moments now had a hidden layer, a meaning I had never imagined. The next days were a whirlwind of research, confrontation, and emotional unraveling. I reached out to distant relatives, old friends, anyone who might have insight into the circumstances surrounding her birth. Each answer I received only deepened my confusion and frustration. Hints of betrayal emerged from unexpected corners, documents carefully altered, memories suppressed, lies told with delicate precision. It was clear now that someone had made a calculated decision to separate me from my daughter, to hide her identity for reasons I couldn't yet fully comprehend. And yet, as the anger roared inside me, it was accompanied by something else, a trembling, almost sacred joy that she had been in my life all along, my presence shaping her without my conscious knowledge. I began to notice the smallest details when I was around her, subtle reflections of myself in her behavior that I had once attributed to coincidence. The way she pursed her lips when concentrating, the curve of her eyebrows when she was frustrated, the way she absent-mindedly tucked her hair behind her ears, all of it felt like a mirror. I realized that all the instincts I had followed as a mother, all the tiny corrections, all the celebrations, had been my own blood, responding to my care. It was as though fate had given us a second chance, a way to live a shared life even as the truth remained hidden. And yet, the most difficult challenge loomed ahead, telling her. How could I explain that the woman she had known as her mother for 36 years was, in fact, her biological mother? How could I navigate the shock, the confusion, the potential anger and betrayal she would inevitably feel? I spent nights rehearsing conversations in my head, imagining every possible reaction, every tear, every embrace, every scream. Nothing could prepare me for the reality of facing her with the truth. When I finally sat down across from her, in the quiet of our living room, I could barely meet her eyes. I took a deep breath, my hands shaking, and spoke slowly. "There's something I need to tell you, something about your birth." She looked at me, puzzled, her brows knitting together. "What do you mean?" she asked softly. I swallowed hard, my chest tight. "The child I adopted, the child I raised, I didn't know at the time, but you were my biological daughter." Her reaction was immediate, visceral. Shock, disbelief, fear, and confusion flashed across her face in a single heartbeat. What are you saying?" she whispered, voice trembling. I reached for her hand, my own shaking, and tried to ground both of us in the truth that could no longer be denied. "I know it's a lot, and I understand if you need time, but it's the truth. I've loved you as my child since the day I brought you home, and that love has always been real, instinctive, and now undeniable." The silence that followed was suffocating. She pulled her hand away, standing up, pacing the room, her eyes wide, her chest rising and falling with rapid breaths. Every instinct I had, every fiber of my being, screamed at me to reach out, to comfort her, to bridge the gap that decades of secrecy had created. But I knew that for her, this revelation was an earthquake, shaking the foundation of everything she had believed about herself, about us, about our life together. And as I watched her, I realized something essential. The journey ahead would be painful, turbulent, and uncertain. There would be anger, confusion, grief, and perhaps even moments of rejection. But there would also be love, rediscovery, and a bond that no lie, no deception, no passage of time could ever erase. She was mine, and I was hers. Finally, the truth had emerged from the shadows, and our lives could begin to weave together with the full weight and brilliance of reality. The days after I revealed the truth to her were some of the most agonizing of my life. I watched her retreat into herself, pacing the house in silence, speaking only when forced, her eyes distant, a mixture of shock, betrayal, and confusion etched across her face. I understood, of course. I had been the same when I first heard the revelation myself, but it didn't make it any easier to watch. She had trusted me, relied on me, known me as her mother in every sense of the word. And yet now, the very foundation of our life together had been shaken. I felt as if the ground had opened beneath me, swallowing decades of love, laughter, and shared memories. I knew that I couldn't leave it there. I had to understand who had orchestrated the deception, why they had done it, and how such a secret could remain hidden for so long. I began digging, quietly at first, reaching out to old friends, colleagues from the adoption agency, even distant relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. Every conversation felt like tiptoeing across a minefield. Every detail I uncovered raised more questions than it answered. There were vague references to family complications, whispers of shame and scandal, and hints that someone had intentionally kept the truth from me to avoid conflict. But the names of the decision-makers, the full story of their motivations, remained frustratingly elusive. It was during one of these late-night calls that I discovered the first real thread of clarity. A former caseworker, someone I hadn't spoken to in decades, agreed to meet me at a small cafe downtown. She was nervous, wringing her hands as she sipped coffee, glancing over her shoulder as though the walls themselves might be listening. "Mary, you weren't supposed to know," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "It was a choice made long ago, and, well, it seemed like the safest way. At the time, you were young, vulnerable, and the circumstances, they were complicated, beyond what you could have handled. But no one ever expected it to last this long." I gritted my teeth, my pulse racing. "Who decided this?" I demanded. "Who thought it was acceptable to hide my own child from me?" She looked away, her lips pressed tightly together. "It wasn't just one person," she admitted. "It was a combination of people, agency officials, family members, even some of your closest friends at the time. Everyone thought they were protecting you. They were wrong. Wrong." That single word felt like a hammer against my chest. 36 years of love, sacrifice, and devotion, undermined by a network of secrecy and lies. I could feel the rage bubbling up, sharp and intoxicating. But beneath it all was something more powerful, an unwavering determination to reclaim the truth, to confront those responsible, to ensure that this deception never continued to affect her life, or mine, again. I started piecing together the puzzle, tracing signatures on old documents, comparing dates, analyzing letters and notes that had been filed away in dusty cabinets. Every piece of paper, every scribbled comment, every overlooked signature seemed to mock me, revealing the careful orchestration behind the scenes. And yet, through it all, I felt a strange mixture of grief and wonder. She had been mine all along, and despite the deception, the bond we had forged could not be erased. Every hug, every smile, every whispered word of comfort had been instinctual, irreducible, biological. The lie could distort the timeline, but it could never distort the love. One evening, I finally confronted my older sister, Susan, the woman I had always trusted most in my life. I knew she had been involved, had known something, perhaps even influenced the decisions made by the agency. When I told her I knew the truth, she froze, her face pale, her hands shaking slightly. "Mary, I didn't think you'd ever find out," she whispered. I was trying to protect you." "Protect me?" The words were poison in my ears. "Protect me?" I repeated, my voice low, trembling with rage and disbelief. "You kept my own daughter from me for decades and call that protection? How could you betray me like this?" Her eyes filled with tears, but her explanation felt hollow. She told me about fear, scandal, family shame, and 1,000 excuses for why the truth had been buried. Every word was like a dagger, slicing through years of trust, love, and loyalty. Yet, beneath it all, I could sense her own regret, her recognition that what had been done could never be undone. Despite the anger, I knew confrontation alone would not restore the years we had lost. I had to take action, not just emotionally, but practically. I began consulting lawyers, gathering evidence, and documenting everything. The deception had been meticulous, but it had left traces. Contracts, letters, medical records, they all formed a trail leading back to those who had decided my fate without my consent. Each revelation, each signature, each documented decision strengthened my resolve. I wasn't just seeking answers. I was seeking justice for myself, for her, and for the stolen years we had unknowingly shared. As the investigations continued, I noticed subtle changes in my daughter. She was quieter, more introspective, her smiles tinged with uncertainty. But there were moments, fleeting and precious, when she would catch my hand, look at me, and I could see recognition in her eyes, a deep, unspoken understanding that transcended words. It was in those moments I realized that our bond, forged over decades of shared life and instinctive love, was unbreakable. No lie, no conspiracy, no passage of time could sever the connection that had always existed between us. One night, I sat at the kitchen table, documents spread around me, legal letters, old agency files, photographs from decades ago. I thought about how far we had come from quiet confusion to revelation, from betrayal to understanding, from despair to a tentative hope that we could reclaim some measure of the life that had been stolen. I knew the journey ahead would be difficult. There would be legal battles, emotional confrontations, and moments of anger, grief, and even fear. But I also knew that through it all, the love I had for her, and she had for me, was a force no deception could diminish. And so, I made a promise to myself. I would face those who had hidden the truth. I would demand accountability. But more importantly, I would nurture the relationship we had built, reaffirm the bond that had never truly been broken, and reclaim the lost years not as a mother in ignorance, but as a mother in truth, fully aware of the life that had been ours all along. The path would be rocky, filled with uncertainty, confrontation, and emotional upheaval. But I was ready. I had no choice but to be. For her, for me, for the daughter I had unknowingly raised as my own, and would now claim fully, undeniably, and forever. The confrontation I had anticipated for so long finally began to take shape, though not in the way I had expected. It wasn't just a single meeting or phone call. It was a series of collisions with people who had played roles in the decades-long deception: family members, agency officials, distant acquaintances who had known the truth and kept their silence. I remember the first meeting vividly, a stark, sterile conference room, papers strewn across the table, fluorescent lights casting a harsh glare on faces that had once been familiar and comforting. And there I sat, gripping the armrests of my chair, my knuckles white, my heart pounding as the room seemed to close around me. The first person I confronted was a distant cousin who had been close to the agency at the time of my daughter's adoption. He tried to offer excuses, talking about procedures and circumstances beyond our control. But every word felt like a lie, polished and rehearsed. I could feel the anger rising in me, but I forced myself to remain calm, controlled, precise. "You call this control?" I asked, my voice steady but edged with steel. "You call keeping me from my own child for decades procedures? Do you have any idea what you've done to her? To me? His face paled, the rehearsed confidence fading as I laid bare the emotional wreckage they had caused. From there, I moved on to the agency officials, each meeting more intense than the last. Some were evasive, some openly defensive, and some quietly apologetic. One older woman, who had been at the center of the decision-making process, finally admitted, "We thought it was for the best. We thought you weren't ready. We never imagined you would find out." Those words, repeated over and over, filled me with a mixture of fury and disbelief. They had made that decision for me, for my child, for their convenience or comfort, but they had no idea the consequences. The years stolen, the love I had given, without recognition, the bond that had been denied acknowledgement. Amid the confrontations, I faced the hardest moment: my daughter's anger. Even though I had revealed the truth, even though I had spent a lifetime loving her, she could not immediately reconcile the fact that her life had been built on secrecy. She accused me of lying by omission, though I had never known. She withdrew, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days, retreating into her own emotional cocoon. And yet, in fleeting moments, she would reach out, a subtle touch on my hand, a glance that spoke more than words could convey, reminding me that our connection was irreducible, indestructible, biological. I had expected immediate forgiveness, but life rarely works that way. Healing, I realized, was as complex and delicate as the deception we had endured. I found myself poring over old letters, medical records, and adoption papers, documenting every decision, every signature, every moment where someone had deliberately chosen to hide the truth. It was exhausting, emotionally and physically, but necessary. Each piece of evidence became a small victory, a reclaiming of the years lost to secrecy. I met with lawyers who assured me that legal remedies were possible: financial restitution, formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing, even public recognition, but I had to balance the legal battle with the emotional care of my daughter. She was my priority, not vengeance, even though the fury inside me screamed for it. The confrontations with family members were the most painful. My sister, Susan, and I had always been close, but even she had kept parts of the truth from me, perhaps convinced she was protecting me. The first time I confronted her, the years of trust, love, and shared secrets collided with anger, disbelief, and grief. She cried, I cried, and we both screamed, our voices echoing through the house. She explained that fear and shame had guided her decisions, that she had thought she was shielding me from heartbreak, scandal, and disappointment. I wanted to scream at her for the years lost, for the stolen experiences, but I also wanted to understand. Behind the anger, I sensed genuine remorse, a recognition that she, too, had been trapped in the consequences of choices she had made decades earlier. Through it all, I began to notice a subtle shift in my daughter. She was angry, yes, and hurt, but there were moments when the bond between us resurfaced, unmistakable and fierce. I would catch her watching me when she thought I wasn't looking, studying my expressions, noticing the same habits, the same gestures, the same inflections she had always mirrored. It was uncanny, undeniable. Even in her anger, even in her confusion, the recognition of what we were, mother and daughter, shone through, a thread that could not be severed by lies, time, or secrecy. One evening, after a particularly tense day of meetings and confrontations, I found her sitting alone in the living room. She hadn't spoken to me for hours. I approached slowly, unsure whether to reach for her hand or let her have the space she clearly needed. Finally, she looked up, and I saw the conflict in her eyes. Anger, grief, confusion, but also the faintest glimmer of understanding. "Mary, I don't know what to feel," she whispered. I sat beside her, letting the silence settle between us, knowing that words might fail us in this moment. I simply took her hand in mine, feeling the undeniable truth of our connection, letting her know, without words, that nothing, no deception, no betrayal, No stolen years could change the bond we had always shared. That night, I understood something fundamental about love and family. The past cannot be erased, but it can be acknowledged, confronted, and healed. I had spent decades raising my daughter, loving her without knowing she was mine. Now, armed with the truth and a fierce determination to protect her and reclaim our history, I could guide our relationship forward. The anger, the betrayal, the secrecy, they would take time to unravel, but the bond we shared was stronger than any deception. And so, I continued the confrontations, the legal preparations, the emotional negotiations. Each step was exhausting, each revelation a mixture of pain and relief. Yet through it all, I held on to one constant truth. I had loved my daughter unconditionally for 36 years, and that love had never been misplaced. It had been instinctive, eternal, and now, finally, acknowledged. The battles I faced, legal, emotional, familial, were daunting. But they were necessary. They were part of reclaiming a life that had been hidden, stolen, and obscured. And they were steps toward restoring the bond that had always existed, unbroken, between a mother and her child. The weeks that followed were a delicate, almost fragile dance between confrontation and connection, anger and understanding, grief and rediscovery. My daughter and I were learning to navigate a relationship that had always existed, yet now carried the weight of decades of secrecy and betrayal. Every interaction was charged, every glance loaded with a mixture of recognition, pain, and unspoken questions. I could feel the tension in her, the way she measured my words, tested my intentions, questioned every gesture of affection. And yet, beneath it all, there were flickers, tiny, luminous sparks of the bond that had never truly been broken. I remember the first time she allowed herself to cry in my arms since the revelation. We had been sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by old photographs and documents I had gathered in my investigation. I was recounting stories from her childhood, memories I had always cherished but never realized carried such profound significance. At first, she listened with a guarded silence, her arms crossed, her lips pressed tightly together. And then, without warning, the dam broke. She sobbed, collapsing against me, her tears soaking my shirt, her body trembling with the weight of emotions she had held in for years. In that moment, all the anger, all the confusion, all the grief coalesced into something raw, vulnerable, and real. I held her close, whispering that it was okay, that it had always been okay, that our bond was unbreakable despite everything. Rebuilding trust was not immediate. She tested me, sometimes deliberately, questioning my motivations, my honesty, my every word. I knew it was necessary, part of her process of processing the betrayal and the decades of hidden truth. Each question, each challenge, felt like a dagger. Yet I welcomed it, because it meant she was engaging, that she was trying to make sense of the reality she had been given. I could not rush this process. I could only remain patient, steadfast, and present, showing her through my actions and my unwavering love that nothing could undo what we had shared, that I had always been, and would always be, her mother. We began revisiting the past together, sifting through photographs, letters, and keepsakes that had long held silent stories. Every image of her as a child, every note I had written to her, every forgotten birthday card became a touchstone, a reminder that despite the deception, our lives had been intertwined in ways that were real, meaningful, and permanent. I watched her smile, small and hesitant at first, as memories surfaced. I saw her laugh at stories she had long forgotten. And I realized that healing was beginning not as an instant restoration, but as a gradual process, a rebuilding of trust, connection, and understanding that could withstand the weight of the past. There were moments of profound sorrow, too. Nights when we both lay awake, haunted by the lost years, by the experiences we had been denied. She would ask me questions I couldn't immediately answer. Why did no one tell me sooner? Why did they think it was right to hide you from me? How could they have taken my life and rewritten it without my consent? I had no easy answers. All I could do was hold her, listen to her, validate her pain, and remind her that, despite the deception, the love we shared had always been real. I acknowledged the grief, the loss, the stolen time, without trying to minimize it, because it was a crucial part of the journey we were now on together. In the midst of this, I began to reflect on my own emotional journey. For years, I had been raising her with instincts I now knew were innate, a love I had assumed was chosen but, in reality, had been hardwired into my being. I had spent decades pouring every ounce of my heart into her life, unaware of the profound truth that I was nurturing my own child. That realization, both painful and exhilarating, reshaped my understanding of myself, of motherhood, and of the extraordinary resilience of love. It was a revelation that carried both weight and freedom, a confirmation that my instincts, my sacrifices, my devotion had never been misplaced. We also began attending therapy together, cautiously at first. Each session a mixture of raw emotion, difficult conversations, and occasional breakthroughs. Our therapist encouraged us to articulate our feelings honestly, to confront the pain without fear, and to gradually rebuild a relationship founded on trust and transparency. Those sessions were not easy. Tears flowed freely, anger erupted unexpectedly, and silence sometimes hung between us like a heavy curtain. Yet, slowly, we began to understand each other more fully, to appreciate the shared history that had been both ordinary and extraordinary, stolen and reclaimed, and to recognize that love, true, unbreakable, unconditional love, could survive even the most profound betrayal. One evening, after a particularly emotional therapy session, we walked through the garden behind our house. The sky was painted in shades of pink and gold, the air crisp and fragrant with the scent of flowers. I held her hand as we strolled along the stone path, the silence between us comfortable, familiar, and yet new. She squeezed my hand, a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but it carried with it a depth of meaning I could feel in my bones. In that moment, I realized that we were beginning to rebuild not just our relationship, but the lives we had shared under a veil of secrecy. Every step forward was a reclamation of trust, a reaffirmation of love, and a quiet but profound victory over the deception that had tried to define our lives. And so, we continued, day by day, conversation by conversation, memory by memory, laying the foundation for a renewed bond. I watched her laugh again, genuinely and freely, her eyes bright with recognition and affection. I shared with her the stories of her early life, the small victories, the moments of pride and joy, the love I had poured into her without knowing the full truth. We began celebrating milestones together, not as strangers separated by decades of secrecy, but as mother and daughter, as family, fully aware of the extraordinary journey we had endured. Through it all, I learned a vital truth. The past cannot be changed. The stolen years cannot be reclaimed. But love, deep, instinctive, unbreakable love, can endure, evolve, and thrive even in the face of betrayal. The healing process was ongoing, fragile, and at times painful, but it was also profound, luminous, and deeply transformative. And as I watched my daughter grow into herself, fully aware of the truth, I felt a quiet, radiant pride. I had lost nothing that mattered. I had gained everything that counted: her trust, her affection, and the knowledge that the bond between a mother and her child, even hidden for decades, could never be broken. By the time the final confrontations and legal matters were settling into place, I felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and relief. The emotional storm that had consumed my life for months was beginning to subside, replaced by a cautious sense of clarity and purpose. My daughter and I were no longer navigating uncharted waters. We were learning to sail together, aware of the waves that had once threatened to pull us apart, yet ready to chart a course built on truth, transparency, and love. The last of the agency officials had been compelled to acknowledge their actions formally. They expressed apologies that were overdue, statements that felt insufficient yet necessary. Some offered restitution, others simply admitted their wrongdoing, and a few tried to justify what had been done decades ago. I listened, measured my responses, and focused not on vengeance but on reclaiming the years we had lost, the legal victories, the signed admissions, the official recognition of the subtle deception. It all mattered, but it was secondary to the emotional restoration that had become the true priority. In the quiet of our home, my daughter and I began weaving our lives back together in ways that felt both new and familiar. We cooked together in the kitchen, laughed at inside jokes we had never explicitly shared but had always understood instinctively, and revisited old memories with the fresh perspective that truth provides. I watched her sleep one night, her face calm, serene, the same features that had haunted my dreams for years now resting in peace. I felt a surge of gratitude so intense it nearly brought me to my knees. She was here. She was mine. And we were finally, fully, able to acknowledge it. There were still moments of tension, moments when anger, grief, or confusion resurfaced unexpectedly. I had learned to navigate them with patience, to honor her emotions without judgment, and to communicate openly. The path toward reconciliation was not linear. It was jagged, unpredictable, and at times painful. But each step forward, each breakthrough, each shared laugh or tear became a testament to the resilience of our bond. It was a bond that no deception, no passage of time, no external interference could destroy. One afternoon, we sat in the garden, sunlight filtering through the leaves, the air warm and fragrant. She looked at me, her eyes steady and open, and said softly, "I think I'm beginning to understand. You were always there. You were always my mom, even when I didn't know it." The words hit me with the force of a tidal wave, carrying with them years of unspoken pain, gratitude, and love. I reached out, holding her hands in mine, and for the first time since the revelation, I felt fully seen, fully acknowledged, and fully connected to the daughter I had raised instinctively and unconditionally. The process of rebuilding our relationship extended beyond the walls of our home. We visited the places from her early childhood, tracing the steps of a life that had been lived in parallel to a secret we now shared openly. We connected with extended family members, some of whom were remorseful for their roles, others who had simply been silent witnesses. Each encounter was layered with complexity, apologies, explanations, acknowledgement, but each also strengthened our resolve to prioritize the bond we had reclaimed. It was a journey through grief, forgiveness, and rediscovery, one that required courage, patience, and unwavering commitment. In the quiet moments, when the house was still and the world outside seemed distant, I reflected on everything we had endured. The decades of ignorance, the deception, the stolen truths. It was tempting to dwell on the injustice, to let bitterness fester. But I chose a different path. I focused on the love that had persisted despite it all, on the instinctive bond that had always been ours, and on the knowledge that we had survived the storm together. That choice, that conscious decision to embrace love over resentment, became a cornerstone of our healing. Our relationship, once obscured by secrecy, now flourished in the open light of truth. We celebrated milestones with newfound joy, shared stories that had been hidden, and created rituals that were entirely ours. Birthdays, anniversaries, simple afternoons spent together, each became infused with meaning, a reclamation of the years that had once been shrouded in silence. And through it all, I watched my daughter grow not only into her own person, but into someone who understood the depth, sacrifice, and resilience of the love that had always surrounded her. I also found my own empowerment in the process. For decades, I had lived with a quiet, instinctive strength, raising a child without knowing she was mine. Now, armed with truth and clarity, I could embrace that strength fully. I realized that motherhood had never been defined solely by biology or circumstance. It had been defined by presence, sacrifice, love, and unwavering dedication. And in reclaiming the truth, I had reclaimed not only my daughter, but also the fullness of my own identity, my resilience, and my voice. In the end, the revelations, confrontations, and reconciliations culminated in a quiet, profound acceptance. We had faced betrayal, deception, and stolen time, and yet we had emerged intact, stronger, and more intimately connected than ever before. The journey had been painful, unpredictable, and deeply emotional, but it had also been transformative. I had loved my daughter unconditionally for 36 years, and that love had never been misplaced, diminished, or denied. As I watched her laughing in the living room, a sound I had always known, but now heard with renewed awareness, I understood the essential truth of our story. Love does not die in deception. It persists. It adapts, endures, and ultimately triumphs over the darkest of circumstances. We had lost nothing that truly mattered, and we had gained everything: honesty, connection, and the recognition of a bond that had always existed. And so I whispered to myself, a quiet affirmation of the journey we had traveled and the life we were now free to live. Love doesn't die in betrayal. It transforms, and so did I. Thank you for watching Mary's story, a journey full of emotion, hidden secrets, and the unbreakable bond of a mother and her child. If this story touched your heart, please like the video and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss more deeply emotional stories every day. Share your thoughts and feelings in the comments below. We want to hear your stories, reflections, and lessons learned. Let's create a community where real stories about family, love, and forgiveness are always shared and cherished. Hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to continue following stories that will move and inspire you.